I remember that day so vividly, as if it were only yesterday. My nephew Daniel and his friend Michael picked me up from my little house on the corner of Elm Street. You know, I'm not the spry young thing I used to be, but these boys always make me feel young, especially Michael. There's something about him that's different. He's not just any of Daniel's friends. He's kind, gentle, in a way that reminds me of an old flame. It makes my heart flutter in a way I hadn't felt in years. As I shuffled my way toward Daniel's car, Michael stepped out of the passenger seat and offered me his arm. "Let me help you, ma'am," he said with that warm smile of his. Oh, I could tell he wasn't like the other boys, full of energy and mischief. No, Michael had a charm, an old-fashioned kind of politeness that I hadn't seen in years. His touch, light as it was, sent a warmth through me that I couldn't quite place, but I didn't think much of it at the time. We started our drive. The boys had insisted on taking me out for a little Sunday afternoon outing. They said it was to get me out of the house for a while, maybe take me to the countryside for some fresh air. Daniel kept talking about how beautiful the lake would be this time of year, but if I'm being honest, it wasn't the lake or the countryside I was thinking about, it was Michael. I sat in the back seat, watching him from behind, his dark hair, his broad shoulders, the way he leaned forward to adjust the radio as Daniel rambled on about some new project he was working on. I didn't even hear half of what Daniel was saying because my mind was elsewhere, on the quiet, gentle man sitting next to him. I started to wonder, what is this feeling? I mean, I'm an old woman. I shouldn't be thinking these things. But oh, the way Michael turned his head to glance back at me now and then, his eyes locking with mine for just a moment longer than they needed to, it made me feel alive. There was something in those eyes, something that stirred feelings I thought had long since faded away. We drove on through the winding roads of the countryside as the sun began to set behind the hills. The sky turned that beautiful shade of pink and gold, the kind of sunset that made the world feel timeless. Daniel was still talking, but I found myself drifting into my own thoughts. What was it about Michael that drew me in so completely? He was young, far too young for an old woman like me, but there was a tenderness in him, a quiet understanding, as if he could see beyond my wrinkles and my gray hair and see me, the woman I once was, the woman I still was somewhere deep inside. Michael looked at me with those kind eyes of his. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking my video. I bet it holds a lot of memories for you. I nodded, but then I caught myself. The memories were there, of course, but they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. Right now, standing by the lake with Michael, it didn't feel like I was an old woman reminiscing. It felt like I was someone new, someone who still had feelings left to discover, moments left to live. As we stood there, I noticed Michael had grown quiet. He was looking out at the water, his hands tucked into his pockets. There was something in his expression that made my heart ache, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "What's on your mind, Michael?" I asked, my voice gentle. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if deciding whether or not to say what was on his mind. And when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've always admired you. You're different, in a way I can't explain." I blinked, unsure of how to respond. Admired me? It seemed such an odd thing for a young man like him to say to someone like me. But the way he said it, there was a softness in his voice, a sincerity that made me believe him. Before I could reply, Daniel called out from down the shore, asking if we wanted to join him for a closer look at the water. Michael smiled a little sadly and offered me his arm once more. As we walked back toward Daniel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something unspoken but very real. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and small talk, but sometimes Michael would catch my eye, and in those moments, it felt like the world stood still. Then they parked on the freeway, and Michael said, I couldn't stop myself, and he put his hand on my thigh. He said, "You're still young, charming, and vibrant. Help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers. Your support is what makes this journey possible, so don't forget to subscribe." I said that I am old now, but his friend Daniel turned around and said, "No, you're not, you're still vibrant and full of life." I admired their courage, and we were in this lively conversation. Michael opened my door and sat right beside me, holding my hands, feeling that something had shifted between us. He started to lean in closer, and I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I kissed him softly on the cheek, and there was this intense energy between us. Meanwhile, Daniel joined us, and they both smiled at me, their eyes sparkling with excitement. I couldn't resist, their presence was intoxicating, and I felt a rush of joy. As we drove back home, the sun long since set and the stars twinkling above us, I couldn't help but wonder what might have been if only I were younger. If only life had dealt me different cards. But even so, I was grateful for that afternoon. It reminded me that connection, or whatever it was that had passed between Michael and me, wasn't bound by age. It was timeless. And in that brief moment, sitting in the backseat of Daniel's car, watching Michael's silhouette against the darkening sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt alive. For a moment, I forgot about everything, my age, my responsibilities, the life I had lived before. All I knew was the warmth between us, the way his laughter filled the air, the way his presence made me feel young again. I wasn't an old woman at that moment. I was just a woman, and he was a man who appreciated me, and I appreciated him more than I had in a long time. But then reality started creeping back in, the cool air from the open window, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the driveway. Slowly, I pulled away, breathless, my heart still racing. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather myself. My mind was swirling with emotions I hadn't expected, desires I hadn't felt in years. But deep down, I knew that this moment, this beautiful, impossible moment, couldn't last. I should go, he said after a long pause, his voice reluctant. I nodded, unable to trust my voice to speak. My heart ached as I watched him step out of the car, and a part of me wanted to call him back, to tell him to stay, to forget about everything else. But I didn't. I let him walk away, his silhouette disappearing down the street as the last of the daylight faded. As I sat there, alone in the car, my heart still racing, I realized something. Life isn't over just because you've reached a certain age. Passion doesn't die, love doesn't fade. It's there, waiting for you, if you're brave enough to reach for it. And though that moment with Michael would remain a beautiful, fleeting memory, it reminded me of something I had forgotten. I was still capable of love, of connection, of living fully. And maybe, just maybe, life still had more surprises in store for me.